you'll see for debates as well as for speeches. Jimmy could probably tell you more about that I'm sure inflation comes up relatively regularly. And so we'll go from there. All right, so gross domestic product, or GDP, it is the sum of all the market for the pretty much all of the final goods in a market. The final goods term is important because it's basically saying it's not intermediary goods. That is one way to measure GDP, but the way that we're going to do it is going to focus on like when a good is finished. To give you an example, let's say that you are buying a car, right? The final purchase value of the car, let's say $20,000. Let's say you buy a fancy Honda Civic. It might be gray. It might be in the parking lot right now in spot D537. So you buy this fancy Honda Civic for $20,000. Now, to go into that Honda Civic, a lot of parts had to be assembled, right? There are 4 tires. You don't include the 4 tires in GDP. Only whatever the finished good is. Another analogy would be, let's say you're constructing a PB&J sandwich and you're selling it at a restaurant because you own the worst restaurant ever, apparently. And so you wouldn't count up the peanut butter and the jelly and the bread, right? You would just include whatever the final price is of that finished good. And that's how we measure GDP. It's all of the finished goods across society throughout a given year. If that number is going up, that's a good indicator that the economy is growing, right? We are producing more of all types of goods, across like the market. Okay, so there are 3 ways to measure. The one you're going to want to know is aggregate spending. In other words, how much is being produced in a society, how much is being sold in any given year. I would ignore value added. It's another way of measuring. That includes like the intermediary steps or the aggregate income. That's going to be the flip side, right? If we're measuring spending, of course, the other side of that is someone is going to be making an income. So your spending is someone's income. Just focus on this. Okay, what else should we know? The business cycle. This is very important. Capitalist economies work in booms and busts with a general trend increasing over time. So we learn this all the time in history, right? If you compare, I think we're just talking about this actually in Global today. If you compare the amount of output that we have today and the amount of material goods we have today to where we were 500 years ago, it is night and day, right? You are living in like the best time of ever in human society, right? It's just a fact. I know you might be, stressed about grades and things like that. It might seem like the whole world is not the best place ever. But the reality is that right now, the reality is that right now you are living in an awesome time in terms of having access to material goods because of this trend line increasing over time with the booms and busts in between. You have a question?
What was the third way to measure?
So aggregate income, I wouldn't focus on that too much. So just know that we can measure it with all the spending going on in society. Okay, so boom and bust over time. So what does that mean? That means we have good times, we have bad times. When we're in what we call a peak here or an expansion, the economy is growing. This is actually where we are like right now. Like the economy is doing very, very well. We're humming along at like full employment. The stock market is up, right? Businesses are expanding, and generally people are working, and that's good. It's where we want to be. But inevitably, there's going to be a recession that's going to come, right? It's just the nature of capitalism. It must occur. There has never been a permanent expansion. People thought it was happening in the 1920s, if you recall. Yeah, not so much, right? Then Great Depression, that almost destroyed everything right after, right? And so, this is timed out. There we go. So, always going to have peaks and then troughs, and then generally over time, those peaks and troughs lead us to overall economic growth. So these are the things that the government and the Federal Reserve are going to be very concerned with, right? What we want to try to do is we want to try to limit how awful these troughs are, right? We don't want them to become depressions. We want them to be recessions. That also means that when we get to these expansions, at times the economy can actually overheat, right? And then prices start going up and up and up, and we have like runaway inflation. We want to actually temper these down also. And then, the idea being is that we can't afford the extremes of either hyperinflation or of another Great Depression. So the government and the Federal Reserve Bank will get involved in trying to kind of smush down this graph, right? So that the peak is never too high and that the trough is never too low, right? So we'll actually get involved and we'll talk about how we do that. Okay. So we're not even going to worry about nominal versus real. This gets really complex. The general idea is that real relates to inflation. So of course, if money becomes worth less over time, then of course GDP is going to go up. But you could see, nominal GDP go up with inflation without real GDP going up. What we really care about is real GDP. We want to see what are people actually making, how much is being produced. if you were to look across all of the United States, right, in this past year, and look at every single person, if you'd somehow had this magical computer that could do this, you'd want to be measuring what is every person producing. Are we being more productive than we were last year? And that's a sign of economic growth. It's what we want our economy to do. We want there to be growth. We don't want there to be a recession where we're making less than we did the previous year, right? That would be bad in the short term, although we know it's inevitable in some cases. Okay, so we'll skip over this because, again, you don't need to know. I don't think you need to know this either. This is all just stuff that would be helpful for your macro. I think, actually, what we covered so far is good. Do you have any questions on GDP and why it matters? Okay, so, yeah, don't go.
Okay, so does the amount of economic growth that having certain expansion necessarily correlate to how much, a recession will basically fall?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer is no, but we do see sometimes if there's an extreme growth with deregulation, then you might see a more extreme recession. So it's more about how regulated is the economy. Less regulated economies are more volatile, and so you see bigger peaks, but you also see bigger troughs. And so that was actually the exact example of the Roaring '20s. The government was like, yeah, capitalism, everything's going great. Why don't we let people just borrow on credit and then invest in the stock market? What can go wrong? And when the stock market crashes, now you owe the bank money, and you owe people who took the loan out money, and then you're not going to get back because your stock is worthless now, and the economy implodes. And so what we decided after that was, let's have some regulations, make sure people can't do that again so we don't blow up the entire market. Right? The housing market in 2008 was a similar kind of crisis, right? There was very, very little regulation, so the boom was really good, right? People were making killings in the stock market and investing in these mortgage-backed securities, but then when it all came crashing down, well, it's called the Great Recession for a reason. So in short, there's not a guaranteed correlation, but the less regulated we are, the more extreme the business cycle is going to be. Hence why a lot of people advocate for stronger regulation, which is something you might come up upon when you're doing either debate or speech, how involved should the government be in regulating the economy. Okay, so that's GDP. The next indicator we're going to take a look at is going to be unemployment, which is something that we don't like. There we go. Sigma. There we go. Okay, so unemployment will refer to people who are not working, but people who are actively looking for a job and not working. And so when you see this, it's a statistic that the government concerns themselves with pretty greatly. They're often very concerned about, who is working, who is not working. High unemployment means usually it almost always correlates with lower GDP, right? Because if people aren't working, they're not producing as much, right? It's just a logical connection there. So when we're seeing a healthy economy, hopefully we're seeing people who want to work getting jobs and being productive because that's where we want people to be. There are a lot of negatives that go along with high unemployment. One thing would be social unrest, right? When young people, especially when young men can't find jobs, they tend to get more restless, get involved with gangs and things like that. It's not good for society. But on top of that, it's not good for the economy. And so when you're looking at unemployment, you need to factor in a few things. Population, people are there. How many people are in the labor force? So you can actually be neither employed nor unemployed. The key difference is that to be unemployed, you have to be actively looking for a job, right? So if you haven't looked for a job, if you've just given up because you're despaired and you think you're never going to find a job again, you're technically not unemployed, because you've left the labor force, right? You're no longer counted at all. So when you see the percentages of, let's say, 5% unemployment is actually always higher in reality. There's always more people who aren't working. Someone who is retired, right, is not unemployed. So some of your grandparents who have worked their entire lives, maybe they're in their 60s and 70s now, they're retired, they're not unemployed because they're not looking for a job. So the actual amount of people that are not working, doing a job actively, is higher than the unemployment rate. But it's still a good metric because we can see over time how is this number, appearing. And so what we're going to see is the actual amount of people who are in the labor force is only about 63%. So there's about 37% of us who are either children and can't work, who are retired and aren't working, maybe who are in the military and don't count for unemployment rates. So the key for things for you to know is what we're looking at is hopefully seeing a lower number in a healthy economy, right? We want the percentage of people who are employed to be higher, or in other words, we want the unemployment percentage to be lower, because that would indicate strong economic growth and high employment rates. Gordon?
Wait, so is the labor force participation rate the people in the workforce?
Correct. So both employed and unemployed. And then you could be neither of those things, as odd as that sounds.
Wait, so like I know on the side here it said the U.S. the rate is 60%, which is like pretty low.
Yep.
But then like did you say that also like right now we're in like a pretty like good like updrive, so like
right.
like how does that not contradict the other?
Okay, so what that means is the unemployment rate is low, but remember, if you're not looking for a job, you are not unemployed. You are in this weird no man's land of you're neither employed nor unemployed. You're simply not in the labor force at all. So some economies have like tons of young people, very few old people, right? Like they would have high participation rates because everyone's working or looking for a job. In America, we've got the boomers. Okay, boomer. And you got the boomers who are older, who are retiring now, and so they're a big population block, but they're not working nor looking for a job, so they're just nothing in terms of unemployment. Yeah, go ahead.
So would that mean there's a difference between like the nominal unemployment and the real unemployment?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to that. Yep.
How much would it be?
Like, what is the percentage difference? Like, so you'd be looking at like about 37% of people who are not in either of the factors. They're just simply not in the market for a job at all. Okay? Okay, so for your understanding, you could be underemployed. And so this actually kind of comes up. So you have unemployment. Who doesn't count? You've got kids, kids don't count. If you're in the military, you're separate. Retired people, stay-at-home mom and dads, right? So even though they're producing something of labor, that's one of Andrew Yang's points, right? If you watch any of the Democratic debates, is that like, hey, that's a tough job to stay home and work for work with your kids, but at the same time, you're not compensated. So anyone who's not actively looking for a job, who's a stay-at-home parent, technically is not unemployed or employed. They're just simply not in the market. So that's how we get to that low participation rate, right? Or someone's just a bum. Your uncle who wants to stay at home and lay on the couch all day, not looking for a job, not employed, not unemployed, even though mentally you probably would think of him as unemployed because he doesn't have a job. Yes?
So then, in order to be counted as unemployed, you have to be looking for work.
Correct.
How long?
I think it's 5 weeks. 4 weeks. 4 weeks. So within the past month, basically, you have to be looking for the job. Yep. Okay. So that's the idea of who is unemployed. Now, there's different types. I think we're going to skip over this because it's not that complex. Just know that there are multiple ways you could be unemployed. You could be between jobs and you just got a promotion. That's a good unemployment, right? Or you could have just had the plant shut down in your Rust Belt town and is never going to open up again, and your entire way of life has just been wiped away from you. That's bad unemployed. That's 2016 election, swing state to Donald Trump kind of unemployment, right? Those jobs are the jobs, those are the states that basically swung the election last time around because of what we call structural unemployment. Their job left and is never coming back, okay? There's also, real briefly, cyclical unemployment, which is like, we're just in like a recession right now, and your job will come back as soon as the economy heats up again. So that's not a bad, it's bad temporarily, but at least your job isn't gone forever, right? Okay, so what else do we need to know? Our goal is to be at full employment, right? We want to have people working. We want people being productive. We want GDP to be increasing. And so all of that will relate to the idea of being at full employment. Don't worry about all of this fancy stuff. This is all just stuff you'll learn when you're in econ directly. But what we're hoping for is the natural rate of unemployment. There's always going to be some people who are either between jobs or have lost their jobs. We can't avoid that, right? So the best you're ever going to see, the unemployment rate is going to be about 4 to 5%. Right now we're at that 4% rate, right? People are working. People who want jobs have them. And there's always going to be the exceptions of those who are between jobs or those whose job have gone away forever. Nothing we can do about that. All we can do is go as close to zero as we can, as we're able to. That's about 4 to 5. Go ahead.
Isn't that contradictory? Because like the 45% is like not taking into consideration all of those uncles or aunts.
Correct. That is absolutely true. And like that's one of the flaws of this number. So I think what you would probably see across time, and the other issue is that like how do you measure those people, right? It's almost impossible to know unless they're reporting where they're trying to look for a job or not, right? But I think the good thing is that because we're consistently across time not counting them ever, right? Like this number still is a good indicator because like people who want jobs and aren't going to get them, right? Like when that number starts to go up, this goes up to 7, 8, 9%, and we still can see the economy is struggling, even if we're not considering a whole big part of the population. So it's a good point though. Okay, so don't worry about this. This is again above your pay grade for right now. So why is unemployment bad? Well, every 1% increase in unemployment rate causes a 2% decline in GDP, connecting back to our previous factor. Why might that be? You lose your job and it hurts doubly. Why is that? Go ahead.
Because there's probably a loss in the economy, a loss in the factory shutdown or whatever.
Good. So it's that job, that production, whatever you are contributing to the labor force, that's now being missed. And what else is being missed on the other side? Go ahead.
Your contribution in terms of buying power.
Yeah, exactly. You're not buying anymore, right? So that means that when the economy starts to slow down and the unemployment rate goes up, we see struggles all across the board because your income and your spending, let me rephrase that, your spending is someone else's income, right? So when I went before and I spent whatever it was, like $7 at Dunkin' Donuts to get coffee so I wouldn't fall asleep during this lecture, I was contributing to the economy, right? That $7 goes into the Dunkin' right down the street. Then they take that along with all their other income for the day. They take their profits, they pay their workers, and then their business continues to thrive. If I lose my job, right, I can't go to that Dunkin' anymore. I don't have any money to kick around on things like coffee. And so now that means their income goes down. Maybe they have to lay off a worker, right? And now that worker isn't getting money. That worker's not going to the grocery store and spending, right? And becomes a big cycle. And that's the issue. That's when we start to hit a recession, right? Is when this number, unemployment number, goes up and it ends up hurting the economy overall. Okay, unemployment is not equally shared. There are those who can survive a recession more effectively. So, for instance, people who have wealth accumulated, they're able to hang in there for a few months with their emergency fund, whereas someone who is impoverished isn't able to do so, right? Like the loss of that job means the loss of their groceries. And that becomes a big burden on the state and also becomes a burden in their lives, right? They're struggling at that point. So the other big factor would be social unrest, people suffering, right? There's the issue of, all the stress that goes into it. If you look especially in impoverished regions of the country, the biggest factor that plays into depression, suicide, drug addiction is unemployment and a weakened economy. So if you look at different states in the Rust Belt or different states in Appalachia, right, where unemployment is very high, you also see corresponding to that the highest level of addiction to opioids and the opioid crisis. So when people are at their most desperate, they turn to drugs and other things to cope with the suffering that's going on in their lives, and that relates to a weakened economy, right? And so hopefully what we're going to see is as the economy is getting stronger, right, you see less of those societal ills that are happening. Okay, so any questions about unemployment? Good? Yes, Kitty, go ahead.
So essentially you want the economy to stabilize, so it's almost linear, so that you don't have any of these fluctuating trends, so that employment never really occurs.
Yep, that's exactly it. And so, and we can't totally mitigate the market. There's always going to be booms and busts, but we can lessen how bad and how extreme they are, right? That's kind of the role. And that's a very political question. I think Democrats and liberals are more in favor of more regulation to, even to shrink down the boom and bust even more, whereas Republicans are more in favor of a more open market process where they're more okay with the deregulation and the bigger booms and bigger busts. But that's just a political philosophy question, more or less. So ideology plays into that. Okay, so I think that's good on unemployment. Again, the rest of the stuff we just get into, I'll even show you real quick. You kind of just look at graphs and things like that, and you can see, you don't need, when you are up there on a debate stage or a speech stage doing XStep or something like that, this is not going to help you. Understanding the concepts, though, will help you so you can be conversational, in that. Okay, so the final indicator is, let's see, inflation. There we go. Okay, so inflation is actually one you might be a little familiar with. Number one, you've got a bunch of the funny stories from, grandparents that are always just kicking around, back in my day, we could go and see a movie for $3 and, get a popcorn for 50 cents. And the idea is that, currency becomes less valuable over time. That's called inflation, right? Prices go up. Normal inflation is good. There's always going to be some inflation. It actually is a sign that the economy is growing and is thriving. It would be actually bad if we had deflation and prices weren't going up. Things have to go up over time. But what we don't want to see is too much inflation. What also becomes known as hyperinflation, which is deadly to an economy. So what is inflation? It's the general level of prices over time, and in general, that goes up over time. Okay, so we have two different types of changes. There's inflation, which is the increase in prices, and deflation, which is the decrease in prices. I really, really doubt you would see deflation in any forensics. I do think you will see inflation. I know some of my upperclassmen have told me that there is absolutely going to be inflation, and it comes up quite often. Okay, so rise in prices go up over time. What we want to make sure is that we don't have a lot of inflation, right? Usually 1% to 2% is healthy. When you start getting up into 4%, 5%, 6%, it becomes a very, very bad exponential issue. Okay, and then again, this is vocabulary, you need to know that. All right, here's a good example to kind of make this more concrete. Here are the salaries of presidents. Nominal is what they were paid. CPI is when you adjust for inflation. And then here's what it would be in basically, I think this was $2011. Okay, so George Washington got paid a salary of $25,000. In Obama's time, that'd be worth $321,000. Grant got paid double that, $50,000. This is post-Civil War, but adjusted, that would be worth almost $1 million, right? Taft went up only another $25,000, but adjusted to today's dollars, that'd be worth $1.8 million, right? So you can see the effect of inflation here, and of course, then Obama got paid $400,000. It was worth $400,000 because you're looking at 2011 versus 2011 dollars, right? So that's the idea: is that over time the currency is worth less and less, and you have to adjust for inflation when you're looking at different like GDP factors and things over time. Okay, so purchasing power of the dollar. This is the opposite of what inflation means, right? It's the idea that the dollar itself becomes worth less. In other words, it takes more of your dollars to buy the same good, right? AKA the price of that good went up. So, I mean, what I can tell you in my lifetime is just, as we were talking about this a moment ago, like the price of coffee. Go to Dunkin' Donuts. I remember at one time it was like literally $1 for a coffee. Now it's just kind of crept up into, you know, like $2.50, $3.50, and that's just a normal function of inflation, right? The ingredients didn't change. Nothing really changed about it. It's just that the currency became worth less. It's also the reason why, if you're not getting a raise in any given year, you're actually getting paid less, right? Because your dollars actually don't go as far. And so when people are like stuck at like minimum wage at like $8.25 and they're not getting raises, they're actually getting poorer every year because everything else has gotten more expensive. So that's why we have to consider inflation when we're looking at an economy. Okay, so CPI, we'll skip over this. We're not gonna go into this. Okay, actually this is worthwhile. This is why you should care about inflation and why you come up in a debate or in a speech. The idea is that when inflation gets triggered and it starts to get worse and worse and worse, right, you're going to see what we potentially could see what we see as hyperinflation, where you could see this is actually exponential growth. Those of you who are math whizzes know all about exponents and logarithms and all of that and how you see it as a function, right? So, I mean, I don't even know what number this would be. We're at, this is million, billion, trillion, quadrillion, quintillions. Are we sextillion, 89 sextillion%? Yeah, that's really, really, really bad. That means that, I don't know if you ever studied after, some of you depending on what grade you're in, like post-World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles with the German Deutschmark, like the inflation rate was so high that like the actual paper was more valuable than the currency was. So like kids were playing with it, like stacking it up like Legos. People were burning it because the paper was more valuable than what it was supposed to represent. And so that means your economy has entirely crashed. That's also happened in a lot of different places. Venezuela is experiencing this. And so it leads to a destabilized economy. So that's why we have a Federal Reserve to make sure this does not happen. Okay, yes, go ahead.
So is that similar to what happened in Greece, for example?
Yes, and so oftentimes with a weaker economy, you'll see a devalued currency. The U.S. very actively manages our dollar to make sure that we don't see this runaway inflation and we don't crash an economy as a result of that. Okay, a bunch of questions popped up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, go.
Oh, so how does it in an increase in like government debt spending, whatever,
Right.
Cause more inflation?
Good question. So the idea of inflation happening in the first place means that like there's a certain amount of dollars that are all chasing the same goods, and so just through competition, let's say I'll pay $5 for a coffee, but someone else will pay $6 for the coffee, someone else pays $7. That drives the prices up. So when the U.S. government gets in and starts doing big spending, they're actually driving up the prices for the goods, because unless we're increasing GDP and there's more and more goods, that means that the price has to go up through competition. Okay, 2?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
why does the price of the single dollar keep going up? Like, if it keeps going up, then doesn't that mean like at a certain point, like we're going to have like if we compare it to like the past, we're gonna have hyperinflation?
No, because if it's at a stable, controlled rate of like 1 or 2%, that's very manageable. And so what you would see instead is what I was just describing with the coffee. It's like a slow creep up, but your salary is also slowly creeping up. So let's say a teacher starting at Ridge, 20 years ago started at $40,000. Now they're starting at $50,000. So the fact that the coffee now costs $2.50 instead of $2 doesn't actually matter. All things staying relatively the same. What we don't want to see is that inflation is 7, 8, 9% from one year to the next, because no one's salary is going up 7, 8, or 9%. But almost everyone's salary is going up 1 or 2 or 3%. So as long as wages are increasing relative to inflation, people will be okay. But yeah, when we get to the big numbers, when we get to these numbers, no one's salary went up 66,000% from 2006 to 2007, right? It's not going to happen. And so that means that you actually became poorer even if you were still working, and that's a bad place to be in, right? Okay, 3. Yeah.
I forgot. But what tools do the Fed use to crash the economy?
We'll talk about that. Yeah. So there's a separate little mini PowerPoint about that. So it's called monetary policy, and we'll come back to that. Yeah. Was that yours question too?
No.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So you said that deflation almost never happens, and then you said that over time currency is worth less and less.
Right. So currency being worth less is the same thing as inflation, right? Deflation is actually currency being worth more. So and that actually could lead to something. This is a quick trivia. I really doubt this would happen, but in one of your forensic activities, but it happened in Japan where when the value of the Japan yen, when it got deflated, that actually killed the economy also, because if you know that your currency is going to be worth more tomorrow, what are you going to want to do with it? You're going to hold on to it, because right now, it's $2 for that coffee. Tomorrow, the coffee will be $1.75. So if I just hold on to all of my money, right, then I can buy even more in the future, right? And so everyone stops spending. When everyone stops spending, what happens to GDP? It goes. And it's very hard to undo that, right? Because how do you tell people, no, go spend your money, when they see their money becoming actively worth more, right? So that's deflation. So you don't want that to happen either. Yes, go ahead.
Just a general question.
Sure.
What in places where there's major hyperinflation?
Yep.
What exactly happens?
So what happens? So it's usually caused by a very weak economy, and it's the idea that they keep printing more and more dollars, right?
Oh yeah.
And so and ultimately, it's only paper, right? So if people start to recognize that, wait, you have more of these dollars, and it's not actually going any further, it just devalues the currency, right? Okay, I skipped somebody, right? So was it Dylan or someone? Brad, go ahead.
Yeah. So the Indian rupee is pretty inflated compared to the U.S. dollar, but because the Indian rupee is very stable, that doesn't mean the Indian economy is a lot less than the United States economy.
Right, and it can be okay because, for instance, India's economy is growing at a rapid rate. Developing nations might grow at 6 to 8 to 9, 10% per year. A developed economy like the U.S. is never going to grow at more than about 3%, because 3% of a huge number is a huge amount of growth, whereas India and China might grow at 8 to 10%. So if they have 8 to 10% inflation, that's actually okay because it's matching the amount of growth they're seeing. So you're exactly right. That will be okay. Go ahead.
Was China taking, you touched on deflation rarely ever happens.
Yes.
China, we saw China do that. Not really do that.
Devaluing their currency. Yeah. So they're almost working, and that's probably a little bit more complex than you would need to know. But yeah, some countries try to manipulate their currency in order to make it look more attractive in the market, and a lot of other countries do not like that because they're playing by open market rules in which they don't do that. So it's one of the things China's been criticized for.
But that's not inflation or deflation.
No,
that's
Forex and exchange rate. Yeah, we're not going to go into that. That's just AP micro macro stuff. So you would not need to know that for forensics. Okay, so 3 quick questions, then we'll go on to some monetary policy stuff. So 1, 2, 3, go.
Just to go off what the last 2 people were saying.
Yep.
Does Forex have any bearing on inflation?
Yes, but I think that we don't want to go down that rabbit hole because we could spend a lot of time on that. So yeah, go ahead.
So is that when people hold on to gold because it'll be worth more in the
Yes, it's relative to the idea of like how confident, and usually gold actually relates to the U.S. dollar and the overall global economy. Like gold for all of human history has been valued, and so if the U.S. dollar appears strong, like gold is less valuable. But if we're not confident on the global market, like being strong, like we think we're going to hit a global recession, then gold is a better bet because that will always be worth something to someone. So that's why you would buy that as like a solid asset if you don't trust the dollar. Yeah, Dylan.
So in terms of like varying oil prices, is that because of like deflation and inflation of those prices?
I mean, it's a lot of things. So there's like supply and demand for oil, like any other product. But like inflation can play into that, you know, globally because of like what different currencies are worth and exchange rates. But yeah, that's more of like a supply demand issue typically. Okay, that goes into like OPEC too, so that's complicated stuff. So okay, Dia and Shruti, and then we'll wrap up inflation here.
Okay, so before when you were talking about GDP, you said governments are trying to like limit the extremes of booms and busts to
Yep.
make sure that there's not like hyperinflation inflation at the booms.
Right.
But like, why is like an economy being really like strong? Why does that like lead to hyperinflation? And like why would just more spending and more like contribution to the economy lead to more hyperinflation?
Yeah, it's like everything in moderation, right? So it's when things are overheating and people are spending, there's only so many goods out there, and yet you could print more currency, right? And so you could end up with a runaway inflation because as prices start to go up, people start to spend more if you're printing more dollars, right? Like you could see a situation in which it becomes exponential like this before you know it. So the Federal Reserve actually, which is going to be our next topic, actively monitors the economy, and when it starts to see signs of inflation, it intentionally slows down the economy. It tries to crush it. I hate when that happens.
Oh my god.
It's worse when it's water too. You're just like the most basic human function, and I failed at it. So should you go ahead?
So like for our LD topic, it was about like subsidies, right? So
Yes.
if the United States government were to implement subsidies, let's just say for like fossil fuels in the future,
Right.
would that mean that currently there would be hyperinflation in oil prices, or would that be deflation?
So-
Or would that just be like asset bubbles?
Yeah, it's more like that. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to conflate like the entire currency with one particular market because remember the U.S. dollar can be used for every product, including oil. And so one of the things they might consider though is how's the economy looking in terms of unemployment and GDP, and you're going to see in that argument that like GDP will be brought up, right? Like if you get rid of fossil fuel subsidies, the economy might shrink. And like when they use the language of GDP, now we're talking about a slowed down economy, right? And so that is very relevant.
For like the Middle East, if like 80% of its economy depends on like fossil fuels itself,
Yeah.
would that mean hyperinflation for them?
Potentially, yes. Because of all the damage that could be done to their economy, you could see a destabilization of the currency. Yep. Okay, so let's switch over to...
All the economics I can take.
I know.
I said more than the economics.
Not for the faint of heart.
No.
Okay, so let's see. We've got... So we did inflation, then unemployment. Okay, then GDP, we're good on that. So Jimmy, fiscal policy and monetary policy, both worthwhile?
Yes.
Okay,
Because you're
cool.
gonna get questions on the national debt deficit.
Yeah.
Like, what is the difference between a debt and a deficit?
Right.
When do deficits happen?
I have a PowerPoint on that too, actually, directly. Should we do that? This could be a two-parter also. I mean, like, I don't want to explode everyone's brains completely, so...
How are we doing in terms of content processing at a quick pace? This is accelerated AP Gov / AP Gov.
Yeah.
We're currently at
AP goes slash
35%.
Negative 4%.
Currently at 35%.
I mean, do you have a general idea of how GDP, inflation, and unemployment function now? Like, that is the goal, right? Like,
We have a little over 10 minutes before we should start packing up and going to the monthly meeting. Who would like to spend those 10 minutes asking questions of Mr. Norris and getting clarification on things? Who would like to learn a new topic? Excellent.
Okay.
All right.
so which one do you want to go with? We can go with the national debt
Yeah.
and deficits. We
Yeah.
could go with fiscal policy.
National-
Fiscal monetary policy should be a second night, don't you think?
And then we can do the Fed on the second.
Yeah, fiscal, yeah, okay. All right, so let's take a look at... Yeah, here we go.
Well, yeah, true.
Okay, so this is the PowerPoint that's going to make you cry because it's your future. This is where the what? This is where the Zoomer looks at Boomer and says, "Why? Why do you do this to me?" Jimmy already knows. Jimmy knows the dark place,
That is what?
the national debt.
Oh, yes. Very bad.
Tyrannosaurus dead.
That's it.
Yeah, we're gonna need to.
This clouds rock on there.
Wait, so you just
Evan,
Oh,
don't do
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Evan,
Evan's
Evan,
wrong.
Evan,
Wait.
so
He's
you
not
don't
really wrong.
Dinosaurs wrong.
Functionality.
How's your round?
Something's happening. Alright, so it's on.
How was it?
Yeah.
Remember when Hamilton was like
Okay, 2 key terms here for you guys. See, Quan? No. So 2 key terms. One is deficit, the other is debt. Okay, there's a difference between the two. Let's say, for instance, that you made $50,000 in 1 year, but you spent $55,000. How much more did you spend than you earned? 5,000. Okay, so that means that you were in a deficit of $5,000 for that year. Okay, let's say you do the same exact thing the next year. You make 50, but you spend 55. How much did you lose this year?
5,000.
Another 5. So your deficit was 5,000, but you owed 5,000 from last year. So what's your debt now?
10,000.
Good. Maybe another analogy. You decide to go to a very fancy liberal arts college. You take out $40,000 in student loans. What was your deficit for that year?
Your future.
Right. Then you go to your sophomore year and you take $40,000 out. What's your debt now?
That's such a
Just kidding. It's like 82 because of interest. Yay! America. Okay. So it is true. It is true. And so that is the idea. So when you hear people talking about student loan debt, right, they're talking about the amount you've accrued throughout the entire time you got your degree, right? So governments work in the same way. Any given year, there is a deficit, right? There is a certain amount we are spending more than we're taking in through tax revenue. And then when you compile that across the many, many years, you end up with national debt. Our national debt is over $20 trillion now, which is interesting because there's a lot of philosophy about whether that's okay or not. Most countries run with some debt. The bigger indicator nowadays is debt to GDP ratio. How much are we producing? To give you an example, most of your parents, unless they paid off their house in full, right, they probably have a mortgage, right? And so they pay that mortgage every month because they don't fully own their home yet. But why would you do that? Because, well, in the meantime, you're living in the house, you're building up your equity and your value, and eventually you'll have it all paid back, right? And so you sometimes need to go into debt to just live your life. And so countries nowadays also spend, borrow, in order to keep the economy going, right? Yes, Steve?
If the U.S. has such a high national debt, then how are we one of the strongest economies in the world?
Because let's say you're $20 trillion in debt, right? But you produce over the next decade, I don't know, $100 trillion worth of value. It's actually okay, right? And so that's kind of the idea is that no country has a zero balance sheet. They all have some debt out right now. So the question just becomes is how much is it and how much does that eat into your budget, paying the interest back and stuff like that. Okay, Shruti, and then remember your name again? Michael. Okay, so Shruti and then Michael. Go.
So with Greece, didn't they lie about how much debt they were?
That's exactly
how
right.
How do they come back from lying about their debt? Because now they have an accumulation of debt.
Painfully, they owe Germany big time, and the EU all hates them. And so maybe an exaggeration, but no, not really. Michael, go ahead.
So why hasn't the U.S. stopped borrowing if it has so much debt?
Aha, that's a brilliant question. We like stuff. We like programs. We like Social Security. We like Medicare. We like Medicaid. We like education. We like roads. We like bridges. We like all those things that we like. We really like the military. And so we want all of those things. And so until we're willing to part with those things that make up our society, we will never see us stop spending. The question really becomes is how much more debt are we willing to go into before it becomes truly crushing to the next generation? Because on debt, you've got to pay interests, and that could be problematic, right? You don't want to go too far into debt. Yes?
For debt, do we owe to ourselves or do we owe it to
Wonderful question. We owe it largely to ourselves and to whoever else who wants to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. So when a government wants to borrow money, they don't just like go to a bank, right? Like banks don't have that kind of money. Like they take out what they call bonds. They say like they write like an IOU. Give me the government $5,000. In 5 years, I'll pay you back $5,000 plus 2% interest. So it's an investment for you. It's money today for me, and now I'm in debt to you plus that interest. So all that $20 trillion is just various different bonds and treasuries that the government's given out over many, many, many years to American citizens primarily, but also to businesses, to banks, to foreign investors, and whoever else wants to invest in the U.S. Yep. Okay. Yes. Question.
So that sounds like the U.S. like they owe money like China or something.
Sure.
But if is there like interest on that debt on like a national scale?
Absolutely. So the idea is like collectively each of those bonds has some type of interest rate because otherwise, why would a Chinese investor loan the U.S. government money? Like they just like us. Like they want to make money, and so and the idea is that people have wealth. They want that wealth to grow. Leaving in a checking account is going to get you like 0.01% return. Buying a bond might get you 2%. So you go wherever you can get the best value. And U.S. bonds are also like, that's not going to be the best return you can get. If you invest in the stock market, you could potentially make much more. But what's the difference between investing in the stock market and investing in a U.S. Treasury bond? You got it, right? Stock market's not guaranteed. Bigger return, bigger risk, right? U.S. government, unless something catastrophic happens, we're not going anywhere, right? And so we're one of the best investments in the entire world, which is why you only get like 2% back from us because like less risk, less reward. Okay, so that's where the debt comes from, is all these bonds that we issue as a treasury. Yes, Dylan?
Would our debt eventually limit like social programs?
Yes.
And other...
That's exactly where this PowerPoint goes to. What time are we going to the meeting?
We're going to head out probably at like 41, 42.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time. So actually, let's speed ahead a bit since we define these terms now. So does that matter? I would argue yes, because if the debt to GDP ratio gets too large, that's burden on future taxpayers to pay that back, right? The government is going to have to pay their dues at some point, right? And so you never pay it all back, but like, let's say it's a 5-year bond, that wave of bonds you took out 5 years ago, those come due eventually. Now, of course, you take out more, right? But the idea is eventually the ratio of how much you owe to how much you produce is not going to be in your favor anymore, and that's when you start seeing issues with limiting social programs, Dylan. So if debt grows faster than GDP, that's the problem. Right? Now, we can fix this, potentially, if we revitalize our economy, invest in education, expand, become the leaders of tomorrow, invest in green energy, for instance, right? If our GDP grows rapidly, then that means that it's okay that we're in debt because GDP is growing faster. Just like if let's say you do have those $50,000 in student loans. So you're making 50, you owe 50,000, you're making 50, and you're like, oh my God, how am I going to pay these things off? Let's say you then get a nice healthy raise, now you're making 100,000. Those 50 grand in loans don't seem as bad anymore, right? Then you get a raise the next year, now you make it 150. Now those 50,000 seem eligible, you probably pay them off outright. So if our GDP is increasing, the debt doesn't matter quite as much, right? And so the struggle is that almost no countries are having their GDP grow faster than their debt. And so that's why we see our debt continue to grow. Okay, so fiscal policy is when the US government is going to get involved. We have a long-term debt problem, right? So here are the debt levels over time. Here are where they are projected to go. That's not good. That's 2038. How old will you guys be then?
That's a good question.
About 20 years from now?
34.
Oh man, right in the prime of your adult life. I'll be going through my midlife crisis, going to buy a motorcycle. Just kidding. Won't be able to afford it because of the debt. So, it could be the worst midlife crisis ever.
Add it to your Honda Civic.
Yeah, maybe I don't think it'll be running 30 years. It'll be a hybrid at that point.
I'm gonna miss your Honda Civic.
I know, me too. We have a few more years together, hopefully. So anyway, this is not sustainable. This is a big issue, right? Okay, so long-term debt problem. Why? This is way too much debt for you, but in general, here's what I would say. Nobody wants to be the president who says, I'm going to cut your social programs and I'm going to raise your taxes, right? George H.W. Bush tried to do it. How many terms did he serve?
1.
Yeah. Okay, so everyone else has basically blown up the deficit, right? They have borrowed more and they have taxed less because that's what American voters want. We vote for our own financial instability every time. Go ahead.
Why don't the president just do it on the second term because that they don't prepare?
That's a good point. That's a good point. A lot of times they do that, but so yeah, they could do that in theory, but I think they want their successor to have a better chance. Maybe that's my big guess. But so if you look at what's happened recently, right? All of these, if you were to read through all these slides, you would just see that like going up in debt, and so Obama went up in debt and deficit because of the fact that we hit the Great Recession. We had to spend a lot of money to save the economy, and that blew up the deficit as well. And then we got to Trump. Is it updated? No, not yet. So 2016, 2017, the tax bill goes through, right? We're in the middle of a very healthy economy, and yet we slash taxes and keep spending the same, so the deficit increases. And everyone right now is like, yeah, the economy is so strong, it's amazing. But what we're not thinking about is the reason the economy is so strong is because we juiced it up with that tax cut, right? But we're going further and further into debt. The micro equivalent, the normal person, not government equivalent, would be if you went to the Bridgewater Commons with a credit card and you bought $50,000 worth of stuff, and you're like, I can't believe I got all of this stuff. Look how rich I am now, right? Except the difference is for you, the debt collector is going to come and, I don't know, break your legs or something. No, but they will ruin your credit score and make you pay it back, and you have to declare bankruptcy. We don't have to do that at the federal level, right? We keep borrowing because people keep trusting the U.S. government. But at some point, that could not work out in our favor if our GDP is not increasing fast enough. Okay? And so that's where we're at right now. Yes, we're having great economic growth, but it's coming, the bill is going to come due at some point. We're going to have to pay off the credit card at least a little bit. And right now, we're not thinking about that. Okay? All right, so we'll get ready for the meeting now, but that's the general idea with the debt and the debt GDP ratio. Okay? Yeah. Oh, quick trivia. What is the #1 expenditure of the U.S. government? It's not the military. Yeah, it's entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things that people are entitled to now, right? Good luck taking those away.
Wait, it's not the military?
No.
We spend
Yeah, the military is our biggest discretionary spending, but those entitlement programs are massive. I mean, think about everyone retired in America getting paid $80,000 a year. Well, it's not that much, but you know what I mean.